Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Ward. I'm at the Sydney School of Veterinary Science at the University of Sydney. I'm an epidemiologist, and this morning I'm going to cover some of the basic facts about Hendra virus, and these should help you with your deliberations on this jury. So Hendra virus, the basic facts. I'm sure most of you would have heard about Hendra virus. It's been in the news quite a lot during the past probably decade or so. For example, just earlier this year, there was this particular story about a horse with Hendra virus in northern New South Wales. So this was mid-year, so it was July. It was in the Lismore area. So as it says there, this is really to get horse owners to be vigilant about unvaccinated horses infected with Hendra virus. This particular horse was in northern New South Wales, around Lismore, and this article is really getting the message out from the Chief Veterinary Officer in New South Wales about Hendra virus. So in this particular case, this horse was noticed. You can see there down the bottom, the horse was noticed that it wasn't eating and that it was wobbly on its legs. So this was on a Friday, and then the next day it was noticed to be lethargic. So not that uncommon with a horse that's sick in these rural areas. Again, in this news article that was published online, these are some of the facts that the Chief Veterinary Officer was trying to get out particularly to horse owners. So I've underlined these 5 facts that I've pulled out of this particular article. So first, there, as the Chief Veterinary Officer was saying, flying foxes are the natural reservoir of Hendra virus. Second, that vaccination is effective in reducing the risk of Hendra virus, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in this presentation, and others will also talk about this on this jury. The third fact in this news article, the Chief Veterinary Officer urging owners of these horses to ensure that contact between horses and flying foxes is avoided as much as possible. The fourth fact in this article, that all known cases to date have occurred in either northern New South Wales or in coastal Queensland. So in this coastal strip, all the way from northern New South Wales up to North Queensland. This is where we've seen most cases of Hendra virus. There have been a few a little bit further inland in southern Queensland, but mostly a coastal distribution. And also should be noted that Hendra virus only is known to occur in Australia. There's other viruses that are related in other parts of the world, but Hendra virus specifically is an Australian virus. And finally, the fifth fact in this news article is that the response to Hendra virus, when it's detected, the response from disease control authorities, that is the New South Wales and Queensland DPIs or their equivalent, is to quarantine all affected properties. So properties with horses affected by Hendra or potentially affected by Hendra would be or are quarantined, and then strict procedures carried out to investigate the situation. So some of the issues surrounding Hendra virus before we actually get into some of the technical facts, and this is going to be covered by some of my colleagues. One is the issue of Hendra virus and the risk that it poses to people working with horses. So obviously that would be vets. Vets work very closely with horses, but also obviously horse owners, farriers, other people who deal with horses. This is a constant risk to those people that have quite close contact with horses. So going back to this case earlier in the year in around Lismore, again this issue of people who work with horses, who treat particularly sick horses, high risk. So there's a lot of tough decisions that need to be made, and obviously it's a very complicated topic, and that's where this jury comes into being. So, again, in this this article, a different article, there's a quote there from one of the vets in the area about having concerns about the virus, of course, if you are a vet. And that includes the infection of humans or the transfer of the virus from horses to humans. And in this particular article, again, the vet urging that horses should be vaccinated. So just an example of some of the approaches to controlling Hendra virus. Again, if we go on and read this article a little bit further, as the vet says, there is a real possibility of contracting the virus and that person dying from Hendra virus. So again, some more quotes. It's a real risk for us, for people working with horses, if those horses aren't vaccinated. And as this particular vet says, it's very hard to just look at a horse and say, well, that horse has Hendra virus. It's not that definitive. So you can't be sure. You can't say yes or no. Absolutely, it either has Hendra virus or it doesn't have Hendra virus until you get results from laboratory testing. Also to note, it is a rare disease. In the scheme of things, the number of horses infected, and my colleagues will also talk about this, the total number of horses infected isn't great in terms of the number of horses we have in those at-risk areas. So it is a rare disease, but the consequences are quite severe. So again, just reiterating some of the approaches to Hendra virus, again, before we start talking about some of the specific facts. The general approach in Australia is that a farm where there's a Hendra horse will be quarantined, and horses that are confirmed to be infected with Hendra virus will be euthanized because of the severe consequences if a person then is infected. So both the New South Wales and Queensland Departments of Health are involved in these outbreaks. So usually both health and primary industries work together whenever there's an outbreak of Hendra virus, testing, and there's set procedures for controlling Hendra virus outbreaks. Now there is also, and again, just going through this article, there is some experimental treatments for humans. Others will probably mention that, but they do tend to be experimental. They're not easily administered. There's other sort of difficulties. So it's not a simple fact of just get treatment if you've been exposed. There are very severe consequences. Another issue that some others will talk about also in this jury is about how you actually put in place a vaccination program. How can you be sure that a horse has been vaccinated? The costs of vaccination, some of the logistical problems with vaccination, all of those are other considerations to think about. It's not a simple matter of just saying every horse should be vaccinated. There obviously has to be programs put in place to ensure that. Okay, so if we go back to the beginning with Hendra virus, where did Hendra virus come from? Well, no one's sure exactly when it first appeared, but the first outbreak was in 1994, and it's no coincidence that this happened in the suburb of Hendra in Brisbane, and hence that's where the name comes from, Hendra virus. So Hendra is a suburb in Brisbane, eastern Brisbane, out towards the airport. Anyone who is familiar with Brisbane would know where it's located. It's located in between the two major racecourses, Doomben and Eagle Farm. So it's a very high, dense horse population in that area. Quite a few stables, both small backyard type stables as well as much larger commercial stables. So there's a lot of horses in this area, and this is where the outbreak first was reported in 1994. So just to emphasize the importance of this area in terms of the racing industry, it's a very important area for racing, and that certainly affects the way or the approach to this outbreak that occurred in 1994. So this, what we call the 1994 Hendra incident, this was a sudden outbreak of what was called an acute respiratory syndrome. and it occurred in thoroughbred horses in a particular training stable in the suburb of Hendra. So the first case that was identified was a pregnant, heavily pregnant, so due to foal very shortly, thoroughbred mare called Drama Series. It had actually been pastured at Cannon Hill. So Cannon Hill is on the other side of the Brisbane River, almost opposite the airport, not too far away from the suburb of Hendra. So it was noticed to be ill on the 7th of September, and it just so happened it was moved to this training stables in the suburb of Hendra, and at the time in those stables there were 23 other thoroughbreds. So this mare, Drama Series, died after a 2-day illness. So quite a short period, only 2 days from the first signs being noticed to then the horse dying. So then 12 additional horses in that stable where Drama Series was moved to, and an adjoining training stable, died acutely over a period of 14 days. So obviously very, very unusual to have that many horses dying so acutely in such a short period of time in such a small area. And you can see some of the signs. They had fever, facial swelling, respiratory disease, very, very severe respiratory disease, so trouble breathing was a major presenting sign there, and a lot of discharge from the nose, from the what we call nasal discharge in these horses, particularly towards the end of those periods of illness. So quite distinctive outbreak. What was even more interesting in this case was a trainer and a stable hand who nursed Drama Series. So that was that pregnant mare that was the first horse to die. Developed a severe influenza-like illness, so very severe flu-type syndrome. And this happened within a week of them having contacted this mare, and the trainer was hospitalised and died, died of respiratory and renal failure. And both the trainer and the stable hand were later shown to be infected with Hendra virus. So this was the first case where certainly we identified Hendra virus, and it wasn't even called Hendra virus at that stage, and the first cases where human infection were known to occur. So all up in this outbreak in 1994, 20 horses and 2 humans were infected. So of those 20 horses that were infected, 13 died, and of the 2 humans that were infected, 1 died. So 50% of the humans, 1 out of 2, and 65% of the horses died. In this outbreak, therefore, there was also 4 non-fatal horse cases. So these were cases where horses showed signs, but they didn't end up dying. And it was interesting, there was also 3 cases where the horses were infected, but they didn't actually show clinical signs of infection. So this is just a schematic of the chronology, so what happened over time with these horse and human cases that were attributed to Hendra virus. So you can see there a fairly short period. So this was September 1994. So it began on the 7th, and we had those horses. Those 2 horses were moved from Cannon Hill. They were out in a paddock, so outside. They were moved to the Hendra stables, and one of those mares died. And you can see there then the outbreak progressed fairly quickly, and within 1 to 2 weeks that was the end of the outbreak. So very, very acute outbreak. And you can see essentially it was Hendra, focused around Hendra. There was also some suggestion, or not suggestion, but some links with a couple of other paddocks. A paddock at Kenilworth up in the Brisbane Valley, and also Sanford up on the northern outskirts of Brisbane. So as a result of that, we did a large survey. Hendra virus infection wasn't found in other animals tested. For example, 800 other domestic animals at that case, both at the premises, at the stables and paddocks and other properties that were linked to this outbreak. So no evidence. We also did a very large survey of horses in Queensland, throughout Queensland, so more than 2,000 horses on more than 150 properties. Again, no Hendra virus could be found, which was very, very, very strange at that stage. This was a very isolated outbreak, very severe, in a very peculiar location. So there was a lot of questions at this stage about what is this virus, where did it come from, what's going on. The conclusions from that were that Hendra virus wasn't established in the Queensland horse population, so it wasn't as if a lot of horses were exposed and just some were becoming sick. It was known to be confined at this stage to the stables at Hendra. It was not highly contagious between horses, so from horse to horse. It didn't seem to be highly contagious compared to some other diseases we see. And even at this stage, it was noticed or noted from both the infection of horses and the infection of the people contacting those horses that it probably required very close contact and the transfer of body fluids to result in infection. So that was 1994. Since then, we've had quite a few outbreaks. Again, others will talk about this in the jury. So up and down coastal Queensland and northern New South Wales. So, for example, up in North Queensland, we've seen outbreaks in a lot of different locations. So up towards Cairns, Mackay, those sort of areas, and down the coast into northern New South Wales. The other issue, of course, and we've already mentioned this, is about vets being infected. So there have been deaths caused by Hendra virus, and again, others will talk a little bit more about this in some detail. There's also been a case where a dog was found to be infected by Hendra virus, and that was several years ago. So we have seen a few other species affected, but really we're focused here on horses being infected by Hendra virus. Now, something else, and again, others are going to cover this, is the environmental impacts and flying foxes as a wet reservoir of Hendra virus. So it has been well established that the reservoir species, so the species where Hendra virus normally resides, are flying foxes. And because of that, there's been certain responses to, well, if the virus is in bats, why don't we just remove bats? But again, others will talk about those sort of environmental responses to controlling Hendra virus. Okay, so some of the key features you need to think about when you're deliberating regarding how we address Hendra virus. Some of the key features about Hendra virus, how it's transmitted, how it persists. The incubation period is generally about somewhere between 5 days and 16 days. So you can think of it sort of 1 to 2 weeks. So this is the period between when the horse is exposed to Hendra virus, becomes infected, and when you're going to start seeing those clinical signs. The mode, we do know that the mode of transmission, we do know that Hendra virus is in bats, in flying foxes, so they are a reservoir species. But how exactly the virus gets from bats to horses really hasn't been conclusively identified. There's lots of ideas and some reasonably strong evidence, but to date the exact mechanism is not really well known. Hendra virus cases report when there are Hendra virus cases in horses, you do tend to get reports that there's bat activity in that area, but not necessarily that there's a colony of bats right next to the horses. There's a link between, obviously with bats, they're attracted to trees with fruit or flowers because that's what they're feeding on, and that tends to be or can be a predictor of Hendra virus, or has been used in the past. Hendra virus, in terms of flying foxes, we can find Hendra virus in a lot of body fluids such as urine, birthing fluids, placental material, so when bats are birthing, because they're mammals of course, and even aborted pups. So we can identify Hendra virus in quite a lot of material from bats. So as I said before, Hendra virus has only really ever been reported in Australia. There's some approximate numbers. Of course, as this keeps evolving, the numbers change, but about maybe 3/4 of known infected horses have died from Hendra virus infection, and maybe about 60% of humans. Again, bats identified as the natural hosts of Hendra virus, and human cases have been attributed to exposure to infected horses. So to date, there's been no cases attributed to direct transmission from bats to humans. It's always been through horses. So we assume that the horses are infected from the bats and humans are infected from the horses, as shown in that diagram down the bottom. So bats to horses to humans. These are some of the numbers, and of course this is only up to June 2017, and the Lismore case that I mentioned before happened on the 1st of July. So these are the totals you can see here, the total numbers of outbreaks. More outbreaks in Queensland than New South Wales. Total number of outbreaks, total number of dead horses approaching, or it is now 100 or over 100 dead horses to date. And down there just documented some of the two vets that have died, and a total of 4 cases, 4 deaths so far out of the 7 confirmed human cases. So the signs in infected horses, again my colleagues are going to discuss this. It's fair to say I think that there's no really predominant characteristic sign in horses that tells you for sure the horse has Hendra virus. It tends to be both the nervous, or either the nervous system affected or the respiratory system. They tend to be predominant, but again there's no key characteristic sign of Hendra virus. Incubation period, again 5 to 16 days. Clinical signs to death, generally it's very acute, so typically 2 days. So once you see the signs of Hendra virus, the horse would generally die within 2 days. The case fatality rate, so these are of those cases known to be infected with Hendra virus, about 75% of them, so 3/4 of them have died. Again, Hendra virus can be found in respiratory secretions, so those nasal discharges. You remember we were talking about the initial Hendra virus outbreak, where the trainer and stable hand were nursing drama series, so a lot of nasal discharge. That would be a source of Hendra virus infection. Saliva as well. If you're putting your hand down the throat of a horse, for example, you're going to get contact with the saliva, and urine as well. We know that Hendra virus can be detected in those nasal discharges, as an example, up to 5 days before you see the clinical signs. So again, before the horse is looking sick, it is possible to be exposed to Hendra virus, and no one would know. So in terms of transmission between horses, we see horse-to-horse transmission being more efficient in a stable environment than in paddocks. We wouldn't really expect Hendra virus to be transmitted within a paddock situation from one horse to another. There have been a lot of experimental infections looking at different species. For example, cats, guinea pigs and so on have been infected in laboratories, and they show clinical signs. You can read there for yourself. Experimentally, also cat to horse transmissions been demonstrated, but all of these, in terms of what happens in the field, well, we're really not too sure about that. There is no evidence of natural infection in any non-equine domestic species in contact with naturally infected horses. So if horses are infected, we don't believe that infection then is going to be transmitted to other non-horse species. Again, it lists some of the fluids, for example, where from flying foxes where we can detect Hendra virus. Again, the precise mode of bat-to-bat transmission hasn't been identified. Some of the early observations with the first cases in outbreaks, typically in paddock horses in in areas that are known to be attractive to flying foxes or where there's flying fox activity, but not necessarily a roosting colony being there. So there's this sort of association between bat activity and the risk of Hendra virus outbreaks. In terms of the timing, initially sort of late autumn through into winter. A little bit different in northern Queensland, where it's more of a summer and a summer distribution. Some of this then could be explained by flying fox activity, the breeding season or the feeding season. But again, there's really no reliable method of saying, well, this is a really high risk period. So it's difficult to use that to say, well, we should only worry about it during a certain time of the year. So again, as I've said, there's compelling evidence that flying foxes are the natural host of Hendra virus. Antibodies to Hendra virus have been found in all 4 species. The virus or the material, the genome of the virus has been detected in flying foxes. Virus isolation has been successful on some occasions. We know that in experimental infections, flying foxes, they can be infected, they don't necessarily cause any clinical disease, so they don't necessarily make the flying foxes sick. Okay, this is some of the material that's put out for horse owners about how to reduce the risk of Hendra virus. They're all really based on trying to separate horses from flying foxes. So we know that flying foxes are attracted to certain trees, so it's logical that you would try and avoid those areas. Horses, particularly in places like Queensland, would like to be under trees often, and you can see then the link between if bats are infected, flying foxes are infected with Hendra virus, and horses are under those trees, there's a risk to those horses. So those sort of these sort of PR exercises, and this one is from the Australian Veterinary Association, would be to try and avoid those areas, so fence off those areas, for example, to reduce the risk. And the other approach then is to use a vaccine. Again, others will talk about the vaccine in a lot more detail. This is just from the manufacturer, from Pfizer Animal Health, about the Hendra virus vaccine, and emphasising how Hendra virus is transmitted. So flying foxes to horses. If horses are vaccinated, they should be protected, even if flying foxes in that area are infected with Hendra virus. So the vaccine, again, others will talk about this in more detail. It was developed under a special use permit and released in late 2012. And you can see all the details about that. Safe for use in pregnant mares, primary course of vaccine, 12 months duration of immunity, the general principle that sick horses should be vaccinated, and so on. So there's a picture of the actual vaccine. This is used in Australia. There have been some concerns over the use of the vaccine. Others will talk about this in more detail. And this is just one news article about when this became an issue, about concern about using the Hendra virus vaccine. So just to be aware, there is a little bit of, there are some issues there that people have spoken about. But when it comes to vaccines and all vaccines, there is obviously costs and benefits when using a vaccine, and like everything in life, we weigh up the costs and benefits of using a vaccine. Here's just some data from the doses administered. This was only up to 2016, so last year. So a lot of doses, more than 440,000 doses have been administered there. There have been some adverse event reports, which is not unusual for a vaccine. Okay, so finally, a summary of some of the issues we've discussed. Hendra is a viral disease of horses. It has a high mortality, known to have a high mortality in horses and in humans. We think, or we know, that humans are infected by close contact with infectious horses. We know that flying foxes are the reservoir of Hendra virus, so that's where Hendra virus normally exists, in flying fox populations. However, we don't know the exact mechanism whereby horses are infected from infectious flying foxes. There is no treatment of Hendra virus in horses. So lastly, recommendations based on those known facts. So vaccination is a very important part of Hendra virus control strategies. So that would be vaccination of horses, of course, avoiding exposure of horses to flying fox infectious material. So this would be avoiding horses grazing under trees, covering water and feed containers and so on to avoid exposure. And finally, ecological strategies which would help to separate flying foxes from horses and thus prevent transmission. So those are some of the basic facts surrounding Hendra virus. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and good luck with your jury